It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the KTC H24 T27. As usual for video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. In the description of the video, you'll find some additional content, including information on how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. So this monitor has an interesting combination of specs. It has a 23.8-inch 2560 by 1440, that's QHD or 1440p panel. That's an IPS type panel. I believe it's a BOE IPS ADS panel more specifically. And this is accompanied by support for a 100Hz refresh rate. So that's certainly an interesting combination of specs, and what's more interesting for some people is that this model comes in at around $100 US. So it's really very much on the budget end as far as models I look at, and on paper at least that seems to be a really good deal. So with this screen size and resolution combination, it's pretty tight pixel density. You get a good amount of pixel real estate with good multitasking potential. Everything is of course smaller and more compact than on a 27-inch QHD model. The pixel density of this one, it sits at 123.41 ppi pixels per inch compared to 108.79 ppi for a 27-inch QHD model. This means that text and also UI elements on the desktop, they're around 13% smaller than on a 27-inch QHD model. It also gives things a crisper look, which extends to suitably high-resolution image content and games, though it doesn't have the same look as a 32-inch or smaller 4K UHD model with a pixel density of around 137.68 ppi. Really, the experience is somewhere between that and a 27-inch QHD model in terms of perceived crispness, as you might expect. Personally, I can happily use this monitor without any scaling, and actually I can use one with a significantly higher pixel density than this without any scaling for my regular viewing distance, size around 70 centimeters from the screen. But things are still relatively small looking. So you may wish to use scaling or application-specific zoom to improve readability or just to make things look a bit larger, just more to your liking. For elements that scale cleanly, and most content now does, you still benefit from the clarity and crispness provided by the tight pixel density, even with scaling or application-specific zoom in use. So in other words, it's a pretty versatile screen size and resolution combination. Some people might just prefer things to be a little bit larger, like you get on a 27-inch QHD model, but for others actually the tighter pixel density could be advantageous because of the slightly crisper look it gives. I'm now going to look at the refresh rate supported by the monitor and some associated features. So connected via DisplayPort, you've got the native resolution at up to 100Hz, and you can select up to 10 bits per channel for the color bit depth. Be aware that there aren't any DSC related restrictions on this model that would prevent you from using NVIDIA technologies such as DSR or DLDSR. And that would apply whether you're using DisplayPort or HDMI. And using DisplayPort as I am now, you've got adaptive sync support, so you can use NVIDIA G-Sync compatible as well as AMD FreeSync. You can also use HDR at the same time if you wish. Connected via HDMI up to 100Hz, but this is HDMI 2.0 rather than HDMI 2.1, so there's no HDMI 2.1 VRR support, and that means you can't use VRR on the PS5, and you can't use G-Sync compatible via HDMI either. You've got a maximum of 8 bits per channel for the bit depth at 100Hz, and I don't have an AMD GPU to confirm incidentally, but the EDID of the monitor seems to suggest that FreeSync should be supported via HDMI, and you can use HDR via HDMI as well. If you set the monitor to 75Hz or below via HDMI, then you can select 10 bits per channel or even 12 bits per channel. Just be aware that actually being able to select this is one thing, but you need to actually have the workflow to make use of the enhanced bit depth. So the vast majority of SDR content is 8-bit and 10 bits for HDR. There's actually a very limited range of content where you might be wanting to use 12 bits, but if you do want to use it or you can make use of it, then just be aware that you have to be connected via HDMI at 75Hz or below. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to take a quick look at the scaling capability of the monitor. So I'm running the native 2560 by 1440 QHD resolution at the moment. I'm now running at 60Hz full HD, so the scaling capability of the monitor, they don't extend to the full 100Hz refresh rate, and it doesn't seem to be 75Hz either. You have to be running it at 60Hz to use the monitor's scaling. You can of course use GPU scaling as a PC user at any refresh rate, and actually the experience on this monitor using GPU scaling and monitor side scaling is fairly similar anyway. So just using the defaults here, It does give a bit of a soft look to things, certainly softer than a native Full HD model of this size, although it's not a supreme softening effect. It's not the kind of soft focus look you sometimes get on monitors when you use interpolation. And there's also a sharpness control. I find increasing this a bit, perhaps as high as 70, that gives a bit of an edge in terms of the sharpness and it offsets the softening a bit. And I'm not saying it looks exactly the same as a native Full HD monitor of this size because it doesn't, but it's actually a decent representation. Decent amount of sharpness, and of course you could adjust the sharpness level according to your own preferences. It changes in increments of 10. It's set to 50 by default, so you could set it to 60, 70, 80, 90 or 100. I find even at 70 some edges and some elements a little bit over sharpened, so I wouldn't really want to go higher, although it's not too bad at 70. So 80 things really do look rather funky to my eye. And any higher it just looks like some really odd filter is applied. There's also an aspect ratio setting, which is grayed out at the moment. I believe that's because I've got adaptive sync enabled, so I'm going to disable adaptive sync. It's called FreeSync/G-Sync on the OSD. Now the setting's available, you can just see that there's full, which will use interpolation, filling up all of the pixels of the screen regardless of the source resolution you happen to be using. There's 16 by 9, which for this particular resolution will be exactly the same. And there's 4:3, which enforces a 4:3 aspect ratio, which means there's black bars at the side. From the front, very basic design really. The simple matte black plastic used throughout and a bit of a medium grey KTC logo in the middle there. Top and side bezels, they have the popular dual stage design. So there's a very thin panel border flush with the rest of the screen. You can just about see it from the right angle if the monitor's switched off, but it's more obvious when the monitor's switched on, as is shown elsewhere in the review. And beyond that panel border, you have a slim hard plastic outer part. The screen surface is what I would classify as a medium or relatively light matte anti-glare finish. So this offers good glare handling. It means that glare is diffused fairly heavily across the screen surface. And I do explore the consequences of that on the image a little bit later on. You don't get reflections as you get on a glossy screen surface or the sharper reflections that you'd get on a lighter matte screen surface. You get limited ergonomic flexibility. You can tilt the screen backwards and forwards a little bit, but that's the only adjustment you get. It's quite a compact stand design. It's around 182mm deep, which is 7.17 inches. And the overall feel of the monitor, yeah, it is basic as you'd expect for the price. Doesn't feel super premium or heavy. It really is just a simple lightweight design. And for those interested, because there isn't height adjustment, this might be a bit more relevant in this case. The top of the monitor sits 405mm or 15.95 inches above the desk, and the bottom of the monitor sits 88mm or 3.47 inches above the desk. And because it's quite a small monitor, that means it sits quite low down on the desk. There are some VESA holes at the back if you wish to use alternative mounting. So there they are in a 100 by 100mm pattern. You can see the OSD control joystick there, stand attachment point, and you can easily detach the stand with a quick release mechanism if you wish to detach it and use alternative mounting. There's also a case slot towards the right there. The ports face downwards, you've got DC power input, and actually it's quite an interesting design because the power brick connects directly to your mains, so there isn't a separate power brick. It's actually built into the sort of the plug end for the electricity. And you've got DisplayPort, you've got HDMI 2.0, there's a USB service port which is used for updating the monitor, and there is a 3.5mm earphone jack, or as some people might call it, a headphone jack. Note that this monitor does not include integrated speakers. Taking a super quick look at the subpixels of the monitor now, standard RGB stripe layout, no concerns related to text clarity from any weird subpixel shenanigans going on here. This is a standard expected by Windows. You don't have to run ClearType. You can, if you want to, just make a few adjustments according to your own preferences though. Looking now at the calibration, so the table here, it shows the central average gamma, which was recorded using an X-Rite i1 Display Pro, which is now marketed as a Calibrite Color Checker Display Plus, and the white point reading taken using a Datacolor SpiderX Elite colorimeter. So a few different monitor settings tested here. Out of the box, the gamma runs at 1.96, so certainly below the 2.2 target I usually go for, and the white point 7616K, so very much on the cool tinted side. There's also a low blue light setting. I like to explore that kind of thing, just mention it and show that the white point is now 4609K with this setting. It does significantly decrease the blue light output from the monitor, which is the main thing it's supposed to be doing. It also gives a rather strong greenish yellow tint. I like to call it a kind of urine tint. It's not very nice. I prefer settings which give an amber tint, but this monitor doesn't have that kind of low blue light setting. You can of course do this with software or just using your own color channel adjustments instead. And the color temperature warm setting, by the way, that gave 6701K, so still actually a bit of a cool tint compared to my usual 6500K target, and certainly not what I'd consider a low blue light setting. I've also said with some of these green weakness, some of these settings, that's because the green channel was just a little bit weak compared to the red and blue. With color temperature set to user, that has the color channels at their neutral position of 50, and that's on the cool tinted side, although a bit less compared to the factory defaults on my unit. In my test settings, I made various adjustments, and you can see them in the second table there. And these are also explored in the best settings video if you're interested. I reduced the red and the blue color channels, reduced the brightness to 42, stuck to the user preset. I changed the gamma to off the setting. It doesn't mean that it disables gamma, because that wouldn't really make sense. It's just an extra gamma setting, which happens to be better on my unit than the default 2.2. or so-called 2.2 setting. FreeSync G-Sync enabled, overdrive set to standard, and I like to set the refresh rate in Windows to 100Hz to get the most out of the monitor. As I note there, individual units and preferences vary. These won't be optimal in all cases. ICCU profiles aren't used in the review, but I have included one created using the test settings in the description of the video if you wish to try it out. I'm going to look at the gamma in more detail now. So this is out of the box. It's basically lower than the 2.2 target for all grey levels measured. So the grey level is shown on the x-axis at the bottom there, from 5%, which is very dark grey, to 95%, which is very bright grey. But it's always below 2.2. So from this, you might think using the 2.4 setting, which the monitor does have, would give a nice uplift and get things closer to 2.2 on my unit, given how it looks with the 2.2 setting here. However, on my unit, that caused it to overshoot the 2.2 target significantly in places, and the gamma now averages 2.33 incidentally. There's clear extra depth to quite a few shades as a result of this, including medium dark shades which blended into the darkest shades too readily. With my test settings, I opted for the off gamma setting, as I mentioned earlier, and this actually was the best compromise. It got closest to 2.2 overall. It averages 2.12, and you can see for the very dark grey shades that the gamma is actually quite low there. It's below 2.0, which does give a bit of an uplift, bit of extra detail to darker shades, makes them a little bit more visible than they should be. But this wasn't an extreme uplift, and some people might quite like this look. It certainly didn't look like sRGB gamma or anything like that. I also like to look at the sRGB colour accuracy, so you can see that with these shades here. These are measured using the SpiderX Elite Colorimeter, and these are the SpiderChecker 24 test patches. As usual, shade 1F, cerulean, gives the highest error. Monitors don't always get the balance of blue and green right for this shade, and this shade is just a sort of good example of that. And this isn't a massive error. I've certainly seen a higher error for this shade. And overall though, good accuracy. Average delta E is 0.77. And this is despite, as I noted, my unit being calibrated with a slight green weakness. It wasn't a huge green weakness, and a slightly cooler tint than the 6500K target. Moving on now to the contrast and brightness performance, shown here in the table. These readings were taken using the X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus, so the Calibrite Color Checker Display Plus. The monitor maxes out at 375 nits, which is pretty reasonable. That's with everything at the neutral position for color channels. Using the user setting and the defaults for the color temperature setting, it got up to 325, which is still quite reasonable. And the minimum I recorded was 21 nits, which is nice and dim. And that gives a good brightness adjustment range. And most people, they're going to be targeting between 100 and 200 nits, although there are some preferences either side of this. So the monitor certainly accommodates that. The static contrast, it sits around 1200 to 1 out of the box, but the maximum I recorded was actually 1339 to 1. That's with all the color channels at the neutral position. And under my test settings, where I made a few adjustments from there, I got 1229 to 1, which is a decent but not outstanding static contrast ratio for an IPS type panel. I'm now in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to explore the contrast performance using some in-game examples. So an IPS type panel with around 1200 to 1 static contrast using my test settings. Yeah, it's not a phenomenal experience at all in terms of contrast, definitely not its main strength. You've also got IPS glow to consider, so there's a sort of brightening towards the corners of the screen or emanating from the corners of the screen. On this model, it's a moderate level, it's pretty much as I'd expect, but it does sort of flood the image a bit there, and eats away at some of the detail and dark areas. From a normal viewing position, you might have your head a little bit higher than I've got the camera mounted here, so you might see it more readily towards the bottom corners of the screen rather than the top. Depends on your viewing position. And also this IPS glow, it would be more intense if you sit closer to the screen, if you're using a higher brightness setting, and if your unit has significant issues with backlight bleed or clouding. My unit really wasn't too bad in that respect actually. Small amount of clouding, but nothing too strong, nothing that really intensified that IPS glow a lot more than I'd expect. It's not all bad news in terms of contrast for the IPS type panel here. Not only is the static contrast a bit stronger than some IPS models, so some models will just show not only an uplift to the darker shades beyond what you see here, but also some of the medium shades can look a little bit more washed out than they do on this model, just lacking a bit of depth and solidity. Of course, this model doesn't have the same kind of look you'd get on a VA, and certainly not OLED panel by any means for those kind of shades, where they look really solid and inky, but still has a bit of an edge compared to some IPS models. Real strength though comes with the gamma consistency. Of course, there's a loss of detail in the regions of the screen affected by the IPS glow, but aside from that, detail levels for dark shades are quite consistent, and I do explore this with respect to colour consistency and how the strong gamma consistency translates there a little bit later in the review. But basically you don't get the kind of shifts you get on a VA model where you get black crush centrally and then you can have an excessive amount of detail. Basically the perceived gamma is greatly reduced towards the edges of the screen. Things here are more consistent. And you certainly don't get the TN behaviour where you get an obvious gamma gradient vertically. I've now brightened up the room a bit. It isn't exactly a bright room, it's moderately bright now. I do have a little bit of direct light striking the screen surface as well. It's just to show you that if you're not sitting in a cave or a dimly lit room, it does take a bit of an edge off the weaknesses that I was talking about with IPS glow and the not incredible static contrast ratio. The weaknesses just aren't as noticeable now. Of course you do get some glare on the screen which is diffused across the screen rather heavily, which really brings me on to the screen surface in general. As I mentioned, it's what I'd classify as a medium or relatively light matte anti-glare finish, so there is certainly strong diffusion. And that does mean that you can get a bit of a flooding of the image in brighter conditions, so it competes with the image and it can give a bit of a hazy look. Lighter matte screen surfaces, they would tend to have sharper glare patches and less diffusion across the screen, so they don't suffer as much in this respect. And of course glossy screen surfaces, well, they give sharp reflections, or tend to give sharp reflections. So it's sort of a case of pick your poison. No screen surface is perfect. You always have to be aware of your lighting environment. My general recommendation if you're sitting in a dimmer room or you like to have your lights turned down is to try and have some light behind the monitor, like a bias light, something like that, or just some light shining behind the monitor. It can aid perceived contrast and also help with viewing comfort. So the screen surface is also a bit on the grainy side, a little bit of a smeary appearance. I mean, it's not terrible in that respect. It is something I'm very sensitive to, so I certainly notice it, but I've certainly seen smoother matte screen surfaces, and I've also seen grainier matte screen surfaces. This one's sort of somewhere in the middle, but a little bit more towards the grainy side. I think it's going to be fine for most people, but if you know you sometimes find screen surfaces grainy and that bothers you, that could be an issue in this case. I'm now on lagom.nl, the website, the test for viewing angles. I'm going to explore colour reproduction and the idea of colour consistency, which these tests are quite good at pinpointing. So the Lagom text, it looks a blended grey throughout, but it has a bit of a green to black striping to the text, with it being a bit brighter looking towards the top, a bit darker looking towards the bottom, but pretty consistent, and it doesn't have obvious flashes between colourful red and colourful saturated greens or anything like that. So this indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, or a relatively low one. The purple block appears unlike it does on the video. It appears a consistent pinkish purple throughout the screen, a little bit pinker towards the extreme edges, but you don't get this big pink blob in the middle and sort of a bluish purple towards the edges like you can see in the video. Doesn't look like that at all. The red block appears quite consistent red throughout the screen. Green block quite a consistent yellowish green chartreuse throughout the screen. Very slightly brighter towards the extreme edges, but that has more to do with the bezel design than a colour consistency issue related to viewing angles. And the blue block that appears royal blue throughout the screen. I'm on Battlefield and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So when you're observing content like games under SDR, or you're on the desktop and you're observing content on the internet, or you're watching movies, that kind of thing, this content is generally designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, And if you're viewing it on a monitor with a wider gamut and you're using a wider gamut on the monitor than sRGB, you will get extra saturation and extra vibrancy. So oversaturation, in other words. This monitor's native gamut, I'm going to put that on the screen, and this is using my test settings. It covers 89% DCI-P3, and for those interested, 82% Adobe RGB. So this is significantly wider than sRGB, certainly quite a bit of extension in some regions, particularly for red shades, less so in other regions, although some green shades do extend quite a bit beyond sRGB. So this does give extra pop, extra vibrancy. You can see it a little bit for the sky blues, but the extension is not too great there, so it doesn't give the sort of strong cartoonish look that you can get on monitors with a much wider gamut, much greater Adobe RGB coverage really. The same with the greens, bit of extra pop there. Some of the greens look overly bright, but they're not super overdone like they can be on monitors with an even more generous gamut than this. There aren't any particularly good examples of red shades here, but when I observe red shades more broadly, fires, explosions, brightly painted red objects. I mean, there's a sort of red logo in the background there, but you won't be able to see it in the video. It just looks overexposed in the video, I'm afraid. Okay, the light bar on this car at the rear there, for example, you know, there's quite nice deep red and the cycle track here, but it is overdone, less neutral than it should be. And you can notice that with earthy browns sometimes as well. They have a bit of a red push, and skin tones as well. They can have a bit of a red push or an overly pinkish look, depending on the skin tone. Some people will like this look, this strong vibrancy. It's exactly what some people would like on the monitor. Alternatively, you can select Professional Mode's sRGB. You'll see that you can adjust brightness. Quite a lot of the other settings are grayed out. The contrast you can't set, you can't select the preset. Color menu is grayed out, so you can't adjust the red, green and blue color channels. But this is an sRGB emulation setting. Now the color gamut looks like this. You've got 98% sRGB coverage with very little extension beyond. So this is an effective sRGB emulation setting, and it does tone the image down to those oversaturated elements I was noting before. They are indeed toned down. Things are just more muted, more as the developers intend within the constraints of the sRGB color space. If you're using this monitor for color critical work, then within the sRGB color space, that's great. You've got 100% coverage. As I mentioned, the color consistency is good. And that's not just for color critical work. You can observe more broadly that shades maintain their richness very well throughout the entire screen. But for the DCI-P3 color space, 89% coverage, Adobe RGB 82% coverage, it's not really ideal for work within those color spaces. I mean, you can do it depending on the content you're working with. But really, if you're working within those color spaces, you should consider a monitor with more generous coverage of those particular color spaces. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running the game under HDR. I'm going to explore the HDR performance of this monitor. This isn't going to be a very long section because the HDR on this monitor is very basic. It doesn't have any VESA Display HDR certification, and that is because, well, the backlight, it just stays at a level which is similar to the maximum which it will achieve under SDR, actually a bit lower than that. Using the default settings, you've got a brightness of 268 nits for pure white and a contrast ratio slightly below 1000 to 1, rather than the 1200 to 1 observed under SDR. The colour temperature is similar to SDR, so over 7500K by default on my unit. But channels can be adjusted, the colour channels. I do explore this in the best settings video, and with the adjustments made to my test settings, the white point is brought closer to 6500K, and that's actually what I'm using at the moment, with good green channel balance, and the brightness sits closer to 300 nits under HDR, so it's a bit of a bump from 268 nits. And the contrast peaks just above 1000 to 1, so it's still a drop compared to SDR. Either way, this is not a particularly impressive brightness at all by HDR standards, or even by SDR standards, to be honest. And you'll also see that because the backlight brightness just remains high, there's no local dimming either. It really just floods these darker details. You don't have the kind of depth and atmosphere you're supposed to have under HDR at all. So basically the bright shades pretty unimpressive. Dark shades are certainly unimpressive. Jumping into the water now. I mean, you do get 10-bit colour reproduction, and it does give you some advantages. For example, smoother gradients for these brighter shades and weather effects, that kind of thing. You can't see that on the video, but to the eye, something you can notice. But to really fully benefit from this, you would need much greater dimming precision. So yeah, certainly unimpressive on the contrast and brightness side. What about colour reproduction? Well, I'd say it does a bit better there, because at least it does have a reasonable colour gamut. Just a reminder, I measured 89% DCI-P3. Just looking at the saturation levels in general, I'd say they're quite good. It does well to tone down some of the oversaturated shades I observed under SDR, for example, Lara's skin. And the reason for that is that the developers are now able to target wider colour gamuts, and you can use the wide gamut more appropriately under HDR. The developers are able to target DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020 colour spaces, so much wider than sRGB. But because this monitor doesn't fully cover DCI-P3 and certainly doesn't offer good Rec 2020 coverage, you will be missing out on some of the most saturated shades that developers might want in their games. But when I look at the green shades here, the water, I mean, I wouldn't say it looks washed out, but there is definitely a lack of depth. Although the saturation levels are okay, it's not just because of the colour gamut though, it's also the lack of dimming precision. It really does sap some depth from even these medium shades, not just the dark shades. So overall, HDR, it does give a different look to things on this monitor. You might like to use it from time to time, or some people might just like how it looks in general, but this is very far from a true HDR experience. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of this monitor. This monitor isn't strictly a gaming monitor, isn't marketed as a gaming monitor, although they market it for light gaming alongside office work or office professional work or whatever it is they call it. But it might appeal for a bit of gaming because it does have a 100 Hz refresh rate. I've got the game running at 100 frames a second, so I'm making the most out of the monitor in that respect. And compared to a 60 Hz experience, there are some advantages here, and they can apply on the desktop as well as gaming, although I'm using gaming examples here. And one thing is that it increases the connected feel. So that's the connectedness, the fluidity you feel when you're interacting with the game world. And on the desktop, when you're just moving the mouse around, moving windows around, interacting with things, basically. It's also important to have low input lag to really maximize this effect. And this monitor does have low input lag, or quite low input lag. I measured 3.15 milliseconds, so that's pretty good, really. The other aspect to consider, the increased refresh rate, provided the frame rate is keeping up as well, it reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement. There's an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, which looks at this kind of thing in more detail, where basically the perceived blur you see on a monitor, it comes partly from your eye movement as you track motion on the screen, and that's tightly linked to the refresh rate of the display, assuming a suitably high frame rate, but also from the pixel responses of the monitor. And there's a technique explored called pursuit photography in that article, which is a nice way of capturing motion on a monitor in a way which encompasses both elements of perceived blur. Many of you will also be familiar with Test UFO, UFO motion test for ghosting, which I'm going to be showing you some shots of here. So you can see here that this isn't a super fast IPS monitor at all. If you look at the reference screen, that's actually running at 120 Hz, where pixel response requirements are slightly higher for a good experience than they are at 100 Hz. But even so, that reference does do very well. It is a fast IPS model, and certainly faster than the KTC tested here. You can see quite a bit of trailing behind the UFOs for the KTC model. There are different overdrive settings which are tested off standard, advanced and ultra fast. Ultra fast isn't very useful because it gives far too much overshoot, and I can see that more broadly, not just in the transitions shown here. It's really very obvious when you're using the monitor, regardless of what you're doing really. The advanced setting still does give some overshoot. It's not too bad for these transitions, but observing more broadly, I found it a bit stronger than I'd like, so I actually prefer the standard setting. And that does give you a bit of an edge compared to off, but again, if you compare it to what you see on the reference screen, the KTC does not have very rapid pixel responses based on these transitions. You can also explore this numerically. I'm using the OSRTT Pro tool here, which is the same tool, and this is the same methodology used by TFT Central, although they use their own color coding system. Just be aware that if you compare these figures to other reviews, different reviewers do use their own equipment and their own methodology, so you can't directly compare like that. But again, you can compare these figures to what you might see in TFT Central reviews for reference. Anyway, this is using the off setting at 100 Hz. In the first table there, it shows your initial response time readings. The average initial time there is 13.88 milliseconds. Not very fast at all. And that's why there's a lot of red in the graph here. But there isn't any overshoot, that's nice and green. So you can definitely ramp up the acceleration. Here things are set to standard, and it doesn't give you a lot of overshoot. There's a little bit of overshoot for a particular transition measured here, but overall not really a problem. But there's still quite a bit of red on the graph. There was some transitioning to orange and yellow and a little bit of green as well. So to certainly improve things compared to off, the average initial time has dropped from 13.88 milliseconds to 9.53 milliseconds, so it is an improvement, but it's still quite slow. Moving on to the advanced setting, average initial time goes from 8.53 milliseconds to 8.19 milliseconds. So again, it's not exactly particularly fast, but it does make some improvements to some transitions, but you certainly get an increase at overshoot. And as I mentioned earlier, I did observe this just more broadly for various transitions which wouldn't be measured in this particular test. So for me, I don't really think it's worth going to advanced because the improvement in pixel response times, it's not exactly massive. It's not turning this into a fast IPS model, but it is certainly giving some visible overshoot in places. As for the ultra fast setting, despite its name, it isn't really ultra fast at all. The average initial time, it has dropped from 8.19 milliseconds now to 6.72 milliseconds, but that is not ultra fast for an IPS model, and it gives you a lot of overshoot, so it isn't attractive visually. So back to the game now, using my preferred standard setting. I wouldn't say advanced is hugely different to what I'm going to talk about here. Just remember that there's a little bit of overshoot. I might show you that a little bit later on, but it can be difficult to capture these differences in a video anyway. But either way, you're not getting a super fast IPS experience. There's a fair bit of perceived blur due to the slower than optimal pixel responses. I can certainly see a little bit of a smeary quality actually behind the darker section of the wall there. And actually the level of perceived blur, I would say it's more in line with what you might expect to see from a VA model or a modern VA model rather than a modern IPS model. It's certainly not as bad as some of the slowest VA models, I'm not saying that. It's just that most IPS models I've used recently are quite a bit faster than this one. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5. This one has some high contrast transitions, so it has a lot of dark shades against brighter backgrounds and vice versa. And this really does highlight some of the transitions which this monitor struggles with. So I can see for those balls or melons or whatever the heck they are there with the flag posts in them, the little flotation devices for boats. Let's just call them that. Okay, yeah, I can see quite a bit of trailing there. Isn't super smeary in its appearance, but it does verge a little bit on the smeary side. The makeshift roof there as well, that does highlight some of these more obvious weaknesses, and it does have a bit of a smeary quality there. Same with the flag and the tree there. So this is really, again, it's more what I'd expect to see from a VA model. I mean, a reasonable VA model, not a super slow one in terms of the pixel responses, but it isn't really up there with a fast IPS model by any means. Or perhaps this is more like what I would typically see on an older IPS model. Perhaps that's another way of looking at it. And actually with VA models, I would typically see this sort of flickering effect with the foliage here. So the weaknesses in the pixel responses would be more pronounced for these particular transitions and just considering the entire response time that's going on. And that gives this strange little flickering behavior, but I'm not observing that here. I mean, it does blend a bit with movement just because of the extra perceived blur, but doesn't sort of brighten up and dim so much that it gives a flickering effect, thankfully, because I know some people can find that really quite distracting. Just quickly switched over to the advanced setting, and to be honest, a lot of the weaknesses I've talked about, they're quite similar, actually. I mean, yeah, there's a little bit of a speeding up in places, so these flotation devices there doesn't have quite as much trailing around it, although it still does stand out a bit. And the makeshift roof is, yeah, it's pretty similar, but I also noticed some overshoot. You might not be able to see this in the video, but around the tree, for example, there's a sort of, and actually the flag as well, there's a bit of a blue quality to the trailing. It's brighter than the background even, so that's halo trailing, bright overshoot. And I can see some dark overshoots and dirty trailing around the light here. But I switch back to my preferred standard setting. And actually, even for this, there's a little bit of overshoot, but it is reduced now. So that's actually a transition where there's a little bit of overshoot even with the standard setting. It's quite a specific transition though. So I'd say for gaming, it's not the best, but for light gaming or depending on your sensitivity, it might be just fine. But of course, some of you, you're not going to be gaming at all. You're just going to be using it for productivity. So what can you expect on the desktop? So I'm just on X here, just to give a website example. You can change the background for various different things, different color schemes. So this is sort of your dark mode experience. You've got bright text against a dark background, a black background. And depending on the application scrolling, you might notice some weaknesses here, but it's not too bad. And actually on Chrome, it sort of, the way it scrolls doesn't give any distinct weaknesses. Depending on the animations you're observing, and if you move the window around or you're moving windows around, then you can notice some more distinct weaknesses. I can see it around these follow buttons there, for example, and around the images as well. and even the edges of the window. You can just see some of those weaknesses, and indeed the icons as well with the black background. Just notice some of those weaknesses. They're not super distinct, and this isn't as weak as I'd typically see on a VA model for this particular example either. So that was the lights out setting, and now looking at the dimmed setting. It looks a bit odd on the video, the background does, it looks sort of non-uniform, but to the eye it doesn't look quite as weird. Anyway, it's more of the same really, but actually the weaknesses are a bit more pronounced now. I wouldn't say it's extensive, super obvious smeary trailing, but there is definitely some what I might call heavy powdery trailing going on here. So the weaknesses can be quite pronounced for these transitions, and yes, it does actually look a little bit smeary sometimes. And I know you're not necessarily going to be moving your windows around like that. In fact, you're unlikely to be doing that, but it's just to show you that certain animations you will observe similar behavior, and it just is to show you that there is an extra mask of perceived blur which you can observe in places when you're on the desktop as well. And using the default setting, which is your typical white background with black text and darker elements, weaknesses are less pronounced really. And fortunately the monitor, at least with its standard setting, it doesn't give any strong overshoot here or anything like that. So I think it makes a better use of the 100 Hz refresh rate for this kind of content. But either way, for productivity, I don't think it's doing anything too obnoxious regardless of the content, to be honest. But I know some people are more sensitive to motion performance than others, so it is worth being aware of the weaknesses. I've just switched it over to advanced because there is a bit of overshoot now, not around the text itself, but around the images, around some of the images, like this image there, for example. You might not be able to see this on the video. Just a bit of bright halo trailing, which isn't particularly attractive. That wasn't extreme overshoot either. There just was a bit of overshoot, which I prefer not to have, which is why I prefer the standard setting. Anyway, using this dimmed setting or whatever it is they call it, no real overshoot that jumps out, again using the advanced setting, but the weaknesses are about as apparent as they were with the standard setting anyway. And more of the same with the lights out setting, which has the darkest background. It doesn't look particularly different to standard, to be honest. Not really any overshoot for this particular example. So as a user of this monitor, I would recommend, try the advanced setting and try standard, see which you prefer. But for me, I just prefer the balance of standard, and I don't feel advanced really does enough, whether I'm on the desktop or when I'm gaming, and I do get a little bit annoyed by some of the overshoot. The monitor supports VRR, variable refresh rate technologies. AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync compatible can be used. It has a range of operation of 48 to 100 Hz, and below 48 Hz LFC low frame rate compensation can be used. Something to be aware of though, this monitor seems to work as expected when it's actually in its main VRR range or when it's in its LFC range, but there's a transition between the two that isn't as smooth as it could be. It's normal for there to be subtle momentary stuttering when the boundary is crossed in either direction, but the word subtle is key here. In this case, there was more pronounced stuttering. I'm afraid it's not something that I can clearly show you on the video, so I won't be doing that. But anyway, there's more pronounced stuttering, and sometimes tearing is observed. It's actually as if VRR is completely disabled temporarily for perhaps half a second or so when the boundary is crossed. If you're only occasionally crossing the boundary, it's not really something you should concern yourself with. But if you are frequently crossing the boundary, it certainly could be annoying. Aside from that though, I didn't observe any VRR flickering, so that was nice, although I wouldn't necessarily expect any on an IPS model. You don't usually see it. But remember, I'm actually using the advanced overdrive setting still, just to point something out, because I'm at 80 Hz, 80 frames a second now. Yeah, VRR is working properly to get rid of the tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. But some of the overshoot is really obnoxious now, really strong and eye-catching. You'll be able to see that very clearly on the video, that sort of dirty trailing around the lamp there. Not nice at all. But using my preferred standard setting, it is toned down. It's still there though. It's stronger than it was at 100 Hz, the overshoot, but certainly more subdued. If you find it really annoying, you could turn the overdrive off, but then you are going to get some more obvious weaknesses in terms of the pixel responses. And I'd say the 80 Hz performance overall is, well, it's reasonable. It's not amazing, because there are some weaknesses even for 80 Hz, which do still stick out a bit. The makeshift roof there, for example. But it's not terrible by any means. Down now to 60 frames a second. The overshoot becomes more pronounced. I'm not going to switch over to advanced, but please take my word for it that the overshoot becomes really obvious with the advanced setting. Well, even with the standard setting, yeah, there is quite a bit of overshoot actually in places. So you may prefer off. But anyway, now I'm at 60 Hz, let's explore this objectively. So you can see the reference screen here again provides a cleaner performance. The ultra-fast setting is useless on the KTC. The advanced setting gives quite a lot of overshoot, as I've already explored really. The standard setting doesn't give any overshoot of note for these particular transitions. The off setting does certainly slow things down a lot and gives quite a bit of additional trailing behind the UFOs. So I would really consider standard to be optimal throughout the VRR range on this monitor, but some people may prefer advanced, particularly at the high refresh rates, perhaps less so at 60 Hz. Just depends on your overshoot sensitivity, to be honest. I'd also mention that sometimes the overshoot with the advanced setting, it isn't just the fact there's overshoot, there's also some overdrive artifacts. It has an interlaced appearance in places, and I sometimes find that quite noticeable even if the overshoot itself isn't particularly strong or bright. Of course, if you've got it strong and bright and you've got the interlaced patterns, then yeah, it can be a bit annoying. Be aware I'm talking about the interlaced patterns in terms of overshoot here, just it's an overdrive artifact. This isn't something I observed on this monitor outside of observing overshoot, if that makes sense. It's not a broader issue with this monitor. There is an auto overdrive setting as well, which you can use, and what this does is it sets the overdrive to standard at lower refresh rates, up to perhaps 75 Hz or so, and advanced for higher refresh rates than that. So that might be a valid option for some who can tolerate moderately strong but not extreme overshoot, but again I find the level of overshoot using advanced excessive in places, even at 100 Hz. And I did show you also 80 Hz when the game was running at 80 frames a second using the advanced setting, and it was pretty strong there as well. So by all means try standard, try advanced, try auto to see what works for you. And just quickly, let's look at some data at 60 Hz, some response time data. With the off setting, a lot of red again, a little bit of orange. Average initial time, 10.88 milliseconds. Not amazing, even for 60 Hz. Bumping it up to standard, 8.66 milliseconds now, so a bit faster than 10.88 milliseconds. Still not perfect, even for 60 Hz. Although again, the pixel response requirements are slacker now, which is why there was less obvious trailing behind the UFOs as well. You can see here quite a bit of overshoot in places, but nothing too extreme. The advanced setting improves the initial time. It goes from 8.66 milliseconds down to 7.32 milliseconds. Still not super snappy, but a little bit faster. It does add more overshoot, and I mean, I've really shown you that and explained it already, but for the particular transitions measured in this test, it might not be obvious that it's doing that, because there's a bit of overshoot in places. It just is distributed differently, and it is a bit more widespread using advanced. The ultra-fast setting, again, not really ultra-fast. The initial time has gone from 7.32 milliseconds to 6.71 milliseconds. And then again, it might not be clear from the overshoot on the graph, but definitely visually there's a big increase in overshoot. You could see it with the UFOs. It just depends on the particular transition being measured, really. It's certainly on the unsightly side in practice. And it's not like you're getting amazingly fast pixel responses for all of this overshoot you suffer through. Last little thing to go through in terms of responsiveness, there is a strobe backlight setting called MPRT that can be activated at a static 100 Hz refresh rate, so no VRR at the same time, and this image shows normal 100 Hz operation beside MPRT. You can see it sharpens up the main object, though not to the extent that the segmentation is super clear or the white notches can be readily counted. It's also quite a messy representation due in parts to the somewhat sluggish pixel responses. There's significant strobe crosstalk, which is repetition of the object behind and sometimes in front. It's not really in front so much in these particular examples, but it does vary depending on how high up or how low down the screen you're looking. And higher up the screen, there's a lot of it in front of the object. Lower down the screen, you get much bolder strobe crosstalk behind the object. So in both cases, it melds into a repetition of the object. But you can see a little bit in front when you look at the dark background, the top row. And just in general, some of this strobe crosstalk, even for this central region, it is moderately strong, especially for that top row. It still remains somewhat fainter than the main object, at least for these central regions of the screen, which your eye will mainly focus when you're playing FPS games and that kind of thing. Although I did still find it noticeable in practice when I was actually gaming. The other thing to note is the overdrive setting can be adjusted, but I'd recommend standard or possibly advanced for the same reasons as without the setting in use, so without MPRT active. Increasing the setting doesn't really help the worst of the strobe crosstalk, it just adds in some extra overshoot. To really make use of the setting, you need to have your frame rate matching the refresh rate. So 100 frames a second for 100 Hz. You can only use the setting at 100 Hz, by the way, or exceeding that to an extreme degree, that could also work. Otherwise, you'll get obvious stuttering, which isn't very nice. And you can't adjust brightness using MPRT, it's locked to around 110 nits. And by its very nature, it's a strobe backlight setting, so it causes the backlight to flicker at 100 Hz in this case, and that can itself be annoying. There are additional colourful flashes or colours such as red, magenta and cyan that can be seen in places due to the KSF phosphors used for the backlight. You can also see fringing behind or in front of some objects. An example of this can actually be seen in the top row of the UFO test here as well, with a magenta fringe in front of the UFO. In practice though, I noticed these flashes and these fringes in a really obvious way, more obvious than you can see in this particular example, and I find it really visually distracting. I absolutely hate that kind of effect. Not everyone will, but it's something which I'm quite sensitive to. So from my perspective, it's far from a clean experience and one I find visually uncomfortable. It's one most people will probably want to avoid, though some people may find utility in this setting. To wrap up then, it was an interesting monitor to test. It's quite interesting to see what you can get for around $100. That's really the key thing about this monitor. It is definitely very much a budget monitor. I haven't reviewed a monitor which is quite this cheap for a very long time. When I did review it, it certainly wasn't a QHD model with a 100 Hz refresh rate and an IPS panel. You do get rather a lot for your money with this monitor. I mean, it's a basic design, not an adjustable stand, not a premium feel or anything like that, but you're getting a wide gamut IPS panel, so it's quite vibrant, good richness, decent potential for colour accurate work as well. Nice usable and quite good sRGB emulation setting. It would have been nice to see more adjustment with that setting, but it certainly did work. The contrast was not super weak for an IPS panel either, not super strong, sort of somewhere in the middle, a little bit more towards the stronger end. And I think actually just in general, just thinking about the general experience, the 23.8 inch screen size and the QHD resolution, it's a bit of a rarity on the market, so it certainly will be a combination which some really like. It also offers HDR, which again, kind of interesting to see on such a cheap display, but as you'd expect, very basic HDR experience. Wasn't the worst I've seen, to be honest. I've seen actually worse HDR for more expensive monitors than this, but it's by no means true HDR because you've got no local dimming, the brightness isn't very high at all. The colour gamut though was at least reasonable, although certainly not full DCI-P3 coverage and nowhere near full Rec 2020 coverage, not that you'd expect that at this price. But I think they actually put the gamut to quite good use considering the gamut they had without oversaturating or undersaturating horribly. The responsiveness of the monitor, I suppose to my strict standards, that's probably where I was most disappointed. It was nice to see the inclusion of 100 Hz, and for some people this is going to be a big upgrade from what they're used to. And if you're doing a bit of light gaming, then it's probably going to be okay, and it is depending on your own sensitivity, it might be okay. And I think for productivity, even just the boost in refresh rate, even though the pixel responses aren't super fast, the boost in refresh rate from 60 Hz to 100 Hz is still quite nice, to be honest. And it didn't mess things up by having super high input lag or anything like that. It gave you VRR as well, which generally worked well, although it was a bit flaky around the LFC boundary. So I think if you want a strict budget, then the monitor could work well for both general productivity and a little bit of gaming. If you spend quite a bit of time gaming and want to stick with the size and resolution, consider the AOC Q24 G2A/BK or Kurai GP01, which are more responsive options in the space. And you'll find links to our video reviews of these models in the video description. You'll also find information about how you can support the work that we do there. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. And I didn't give my usual outro by saying that's really all there is to the KTC H24 T27, but now I have said it.